November 3, 1944. The Atlantic stretched endlessly under a dark, cloudless sky, deceptively calm. American destroyers moved steadily toward Europe, carrying supplies and men whose lives depended on the journey. Intelligence had tracked German naval movements, yet even seasoned officers underestimated the scale of what lay ahead. From the horizon, a shadow emerged. At first indistinct, blurred by mist and darkness, it grew into a form too massive to ignore, a German battleship, a floating fortress, its silhouette cutting the waves with terrifying purpose. It was more than a ship, it was a weapon, engineered for destruction and designed to strike fear into the hearts of those who faced it. Before the Americans could react, flashes of gunfire lit the night sky. Shells tore through the water, sending explosive plumes into the air. Each impact shook the deck, forcing men to brace against the tremors. The destroyers fired back, but their shells often fell short or glanced harmlessly off the German armor. The ship moved with unnatural precision, striking and retreating like a predator. High above, the first signs of aerial conflict erupted. German fighters dived through the smoke-filled sky, their wings cutting through the moonlight. American planes scrambled from carriers nearby, engaged in deadly dogfights. Explosions and tracer fire streaked across the horizon. Every plane that fell into the dark waters below sent ripples of horror across the decks of the ships. Meanwhile, along the nearby coastlines, armored divisions of German tanks rolled silently through forests and abandoned towns, awaiting orders to support the naval assault. Their cannons fired into strategic positions, shelling makeshift American positions and supply depots. The gunfire echoed across the water, blending with the thundering cannons of the battleships and the roaring engines of the dogfighting planes. Amid the chaos, one destroyer approached a small, hidden island. Scouts reported movement, structures half buried in sand and forest. Bursts of tank fire tore through the foliage, revealing camouflaged bunkers and artillery placements. From inside, strange crates were glimpsed, sealed, marked with cryptic symbols. The Americans suspected they might contain supplies, intelligence, or even weapons that could change the course of the war, but the full truth remained hidden, obscured by smoke, fire, and the chaos of battle. Explosions rocked the decks again. Shrapnel rained down on men scrambling to reload guns. The German battleships shifted forward, firing volleys with terrifying accuracy. Smoke from burning oil mixed with mist, blurring the line between sea and sky. Jets of water from near misses drenched the decks. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, salt, and smoke, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of destruction. Amid the carnage, the Americans began to understand the scale of the assault. This was no ordinary naval skirmish. It was an orchestration, a combination of ships, aircraft, and armored units, designed to overwhelm and disorient. And hidden within this attack, waiting quietly, was a secret that could tilt the balance of the Atlantic theater if discovered. As night bled into dawn, burning wreckage drifted across the water. Smoke spiraled into the sky, planes limped back toward carriers, and tanks rolled to new positions along the coastline. The German battleship had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind destruction and a growing sense of unease. The Americans had survived, but barely, and the question lingered in every mind aboard: what had they truly fought that night? And what secrets remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered in the misty ruins of war? The night air hung heavy with smoke and salt, carrying the echo of the previous assaults. Flashes of fire still punctuated the horizon as the German battleship vanished into the mist, but its presence lingered like a shadow over every deck, every wave, every heartbeat. The American convoy pressed forward, each ship alert, every sailor tense, knowing that the danger was far from over. From the clouds above, German fighters reappeared, slicing through the darkness with deadly precision. Their engines screamed as they dove, twisting and turning in pursuit of the American planes. Tracer rounds lanced the night sky, intersecting in deadly patterns. Explosions erupted midair as fighters collided, sending fiery wreckage plummeting into the ocean. The water below reflected the chaos like a fractured mirror. On the nearest coastline, armored columns of German tanks began their advance. Hidden in forested hills, they emerged in sudden bursts, their tracks tearing through undergrowth, their engines growling like beasts. Cannons roared from concealed positions, shattering barricades, blasting supply depots, and tearing through temporary fortifications. The ground quaked with each impact, shaking the earth beneath advancing American troops, who struggled to set up defenses while under relentless fire. Artillery shells from the coast exploded on the beach, sending sand and debris into the air. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with fire from naval gunfire, masking the movements of both sides. The Americans tried to respond, firing from elevated positions, but the tanks moved with coordinated precision, their armor shrugging off most of the bullets. Each tank struck quickly, vanished behind foliage, and then reappeared at another position, like ghosts in steel. Meanwhile, in the sky, American fighters attempted to establish air superiority. Dogfights erupted across the horizon, engines screaming, guns tearing streaks across clouds and darkness. Planes twisted and dove, each maneuver a gamble between life and death. Tracer rounds seared the night, and the occasional explosion illuminated the water with red and white bursts. Some pilots fell into the sea in flaming wreckage, while others executed impossible maneuvers to survive and retaliate. Back at sea, the survivors of the initial naval engagement struggled to regain order. Fires from earlier hits still burned on the decks. Hulls were scarred, metal twisted, and supplies lost to water and flame. The men worked feverishly to reload cannons, repair critical equipment, and maintain position. Every action was measured, deliberate, a test of endurance against the relentless German onslaught. Amid the chaos, scouts on a smaller American vessel reported movement along the coast. Hidden bunkers, partially buried beneath sand and trees, had been overlooked in previous reconnaissance. Their steel doors gleamed faintly in the moonlight, nearly invisible from the sea. The Americans understood instinctively. These structures could contain intelligence, weaponry, or cargo so important it might change the course of the engagement if captured. As artillery fire rained down, one scouting team launched a daring approach. Small boats slipped toward the shore under cover of smoke, the oars cutting silently through the water. Every heartbeat was measured, every breath calculated. Overhead, the dogfights continued, providing intermittent cover as anti-aircraft rounds from the shore and ships tore the sky into violent flashes. Tanks continued their relentless advance, moving parallel to the shoreline, cutting supply lines, and striking any visible installations. Each shell that landed sent geysers of earth and splinters into the air. The American teams pressed forward, balancing speed with caution. The bunkers loomed closer, their steel doors intimidating in their stillness, promising secrets hidden for decades. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the ground. A coastal battery, firing at advancing tanks, was obliterated by a German shell. Trees were ripped apart, and smoke spiraled into the night sky, obscuring vision across the beach. Another battery followed, a chain reaction of destruction that left sand, steel, and fire mingled in chaotic patterns. Through the haze of smoke and the roar of battle, the Americans pressed on. Gunfire, tracer rounds, and explosions became a constant rhythm, the soundtrack of survival against overwhelming odds. The tanks pressed forward, the planes roared overhead, and the sea continued to churn with naval conflict. And then, amid the chaos, the first hints of discovery emerged. The bunkers, partially destroyed by tank fire, revealed crates and barrels marked with unfamiliar insignias. Men dared to glimpse inside, seeing equipment and documents that hinted at operations previously unknown. Supplies, coded intelligence, and experimental weapons suggested a plan long hidden, one that had been shielded from the eyes of the Allies and perhaps intended to tip the scales of the war in favor of the Axis. Even as the men worked to secure the contents, the German forces launched a coordinated counterattack. Tanks pivoted with terrifying precision, guns firing from multiple angles. Planes swept low, attempting to suppress any effort to remove the secrets from the bunkers. The naval threat, though distant, loomed in reports, more enemy ships could appear at any moment, continuing the relentless siege. By dawn, the battlefield stretched across sea, air, and land, a chaotic tableau of fire, steel, and smoke. Yet amidst the destruction, a fragile victory was forming. The bunkers had been partially breached, revealing secrets thought lost to the war. The American forces, exhausted and battered, realized they had survived an onslaught unlike any other, a convergence of technology, tactics, and chaos designed to obliterate everything in its path. But even as they collected the first fragments of hidden intelligence, the survivors knew the fight was far from over. Across the horizon, shadows hinted at more German forces, ships, planes, and armored columns poised to strike again. And the secrets discovered in the bunkers, while valuable, carried with them a new danger, the knowledge that the full scope of the German plan had yet to be revealed, and the true cost of uncovering it was still unknown. The morning mist hung low over the water, thick and suffocating, turning the horizon into a gray blur. The American convoy, though battered from the previous night, pressed onward, engines straining against waves that now felt heavier, as if the sea itself resented their passage. Smoke from burning vessels lingered in the air, mingling with salt and the acrid tang of gunpowder. The remnants of previous firefights floated in the currents, splintered wood, twisted steel, and the unbroken silence of what had once been men and machines. Above the ocean, the sky had become a war zone. German fighters continued their relentless sorties, diving through the clouds with precision strikes. American planes rose to meet them, engines screaming and guns spitting fire. Each dogfight was a ballet of death, twisting wings, barrel rolls, evasive maneuvers, tracer lines burning across the sky. When planes collided, or were ripped apart by enemy rounds, their remains fell into the water in flaming arcs, leaving fiery trails that reflected in the waves below. Meanwhile, on the nearby coastline, the tank battles escalated. American crews, though weary, had reorganized and set up temporary defensive positions. Sandbags and barricades offered limited protection against the advancing German armor, which moved like a tide of steel, relentless and unstoppable. Cannons boomed, sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. Trees were uprooted, roads shattered, and the very earth quaked under the repeated impact of heavy shells. Through the haze, American scouts approached the partially breached bunkers. Smoke and fire from the previous engagement had revealed openings in the steel doors, giving glimpses of crates and containers inside. Each discovery heightened both hope and fear. Supplies, experimental equipment, and documents were visible, but much of it remained obscured, and the enemy was still nearby. Every step toward the bunkers carried the risk of destruction from tanks, artillery, or air attacks. The German armored columns, sensing their advantage, pivoted toward the bunkers. Tanks fired in carefully coordinated sequences, shells tearing through sand and steel, sending geysers of earth and shrapnel skyward. The Americans returned fire, but the precision of the German crews, combined with the confusion of the smoke-filled battlefield, made counterattacks perilous. Every explosion threatened to collapse sections of the bunkers and bury the precious cargo inside. High above, the dogfights reached a fever pitch. Planes dived low to strike tanks and shore batteries. Machine gun fire raked the forested hills and beach positions, sending plumes of dust and flame into the air. Every engagement carried risk. A single miscalculation could send an aircraft plummeting into the sea, adding to the chaos below. Yet, amidst the chaos, American pilots executed daring maneuvers to suppress the German advance and protect the teams approaching the bunkers. Inside the bunkers, men moved quickly, documenting, photographing, and attempting to secure crates. Strange markings on barrels hinted at advanced weaponry or experimental munitions. Faded symbols on some documents suggested long-forgotten operations, plans that could have changed the war if they had been executed. The mystery deepened with every crate opened. What seemed like conventional supplies often contained more sinister secrets, new weapons, coded intelligence, and devices no one fully understood. The sea, meanwhile, had not forgotten the human struggle above it. German destroyers and smaller vessels began to move in, attempting to prevent the Americans from reaching the shore. The ocean erupted into a maelstrom of shells and explosions, turning calm waters into boiling chaos. American destroyers fired back, trading salvos with enemy ships in a battle of precision and endurance. Each hit sent sprays of water and twisted metal into the air. Ships tilted, rocked, and groaned under the strain, crews working tirelessly to maintain their positions. On land, the tank battle reached its climax. Explosions split the air with deafening force. Some bunkers collapsed partially under repeated artillery hits, sending flames and smoke into the sky. Trees were splintered, earth torn apart, and the line between attacker and defender blurred under the relentless assault. Yet, despite overwhelming odds, the American forces pressed forward, extracting crates and salvaging intelligence wherever they could. From the sky, fighter pilots provided intermittent cover, weaving through the clouds to strike at advancing tanks or enemy artillery positions. Their coordinated attacks created fleeting windows of opportunity for the ground teams. The smell of cordite, burning oil, and scorched metal filled the air, mixed with the salty tang of the ocean. Each second stretched into minutes as men moved under fire, working with urgency that could not be measured in normal terms. By midday, the battlefield had transformed into a surreal landscape. Smoke hung thick over sand, forest, and sea. Flames licked the remnants of shattered bunkers and burned vehicles. Pieces of planes drifted down from above. The German forces had momentarily retreated, forced back by precise counterattacks and the fierce determination of American crews. Yet the full scope of the German plan remained a mystery. Some crates had been recovered, revealing intelligence documents, experimental munitions, and partially dismantled weapons. But many containers were still locked, some buried beneath sand and debris. The Americans realized that their discovery had only scratched the surface. The true danger, and the full potential of what had been hidden, remained unknown, a secret buried in shadows, waiting for another moment of revelation. As the sun rose, casting light over the smoke-stained horizon, it illuminated the scale of the battle. Tanks lay overturned, ships floated scarred and battered, and planes circled overhead like restless ghosts. The Americans had survived, but only barely. The night and morning had revealed both the power of the enemy and the fragility of their own position. The mystery of the German bunkers, the secret cargo, and the extent of the coordinated assault would haunt every historian who later examined the events of that day. And yet the survivors knew that this was only the beginning. Across sea, sky, and land, the enemy still lurked. Every crate, every document, every piece of experimental equipment extracted from the bunkers held answers, but also questions that were far more dangerous than any shell or explosion. The battle had raged, leaving devastation in its wake. But the true story, the hidden consequences of the discoveries made, was only beginning to unfold. By late afternoon, the battlefield had become a maelstrom of fire, steel, and smoke. The Atlantic no longer reflected the sky, it reflected chaos. Waves glistened with oil, dotted with debris from shattered ships, smoldering crates, and the charred remnants of downed aircraft. Every American destroyer that had survived the initial assault bore the scars of the German onslaught: twisted hulls, blackened decks, and smoke that curled like a living entity into the heavy sky. From above, German fighters surged once again, their silhouettes slicing through clouds like knives. American pilots, exhausted but relentless, met them with equal ferocity. Dogfights erupted directly over the battered convoy, tracers stitching through smoke and sunlight, painting the sky with lethal streaks. The roar of engines, the flash of guns, and the occasional fireball of a crashing plane became the soundtrack of the engagement. Some planes spiraled into the ocean, leaving trails of fire that reflected off the dark water below, while others twisted through the clouds in near impossible maneuvers, strafing tanks and coastal artillery in fleeting bursts of precision. Along the nearby shore, the tank war intensified. German armored columns, regrouping after previous setbacks, advanced with terrifying coordination. Their cannons thundered against American defensive positions, shattering sandbags, tearing through barricades, and throwing debris high into the air. The ground itself seemed to quake under the relentless assault, each explosion creating temporary craters that swallowed men, equipment, and hope alike. American crews, though exhausted, had fortified their positions. Tank destroyers were maneuvered into narrow passes, using terrain to create choke points. Every shell fired carried the weight of desperation and precision. When German tanks rolled into range, explosions erupted in rapid succession, sending plumes of smoke, earth, and fire into the sky. Trees splintered. Roads were ripped apart. The battle had transformed the coastline into a surreal landscape, where each moment was a life-or-death gamble. Amid the storm, attention returned to the hidden bunkers. The initial scouting teams had begun to fully breach several of the steel doors, revealing crates marked with cryptic symbols and stamps of a German research division. Some barrels contained experimental munitions, others contained intelligence documents detailing operations that had been hidden from the world for years. The discovery hinted at a plan so extensive, so meticulous, that it could have altered the course of the Atlantic War if fully executed. Yet, even as the Americans worked to catalog the contents, the Germans mounted a coordinated counteroffensive. Tanks pivoted through forested hills, guns blazing, targeting positions protecting the bunkers. Planes swooped low to strafe the beach, their machine gun fire shredding sandbags and barricades. From the sea, smaller enemy vessels began to reappear, sending artillery fire toward the shore, each round tearing through debris and threatening the fragile progress of the discovery teams. The Americans responded with calculated fury. Naval guns fired into the distance, the thunderous volleys striking German positions near the coast. Anti-tank teams engaged the armored columns, using terrain and careful positioning to their advantage. Fighter planes dove and rolled overhead, strafing artillery positions and providing fleeting cover for the men on the ground. Every second was a delicate balance between destruction and survival. Inside the bunkers, the scale of the hidden cargo became clearer. Crates contained not only weapons and documents but evidence of operations that had been meticulously concealed, blueprints, coded dispatches, and experimental devices never before revealed in Allied intelligence. The nature of some equipment suggested early guided munitions and prototype technology, a chilling reminder that the Axis powers had resources far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. The implications were staggering: the potential to strike further into Allied territory, disrupt supply lines, and change the balance of naval and coastal warfare. The battle's intensity peaked as German tanks pressed closer, firing relentlessly, while fighter planes performed daring attacks on both sea and shore. Each explosion, each screeching shell, threatened to destroy the very evidence the Americans were struggling to preserve. Smoke, fire, and debris created an almost apocalyptic scene, blending sea, sky, and land into a tableau of near-total chaos. Yet the American forces, though battered, held their ground. Naval gunners managed precise strikes against approaching vessels. Anti-tank units slowed the German advance. Pilots executed near-impossible maneuvers, keeping enemy aircraft engaged and preventing them from focusing solely on the bunkers. It was a delicate dance, a fleeting balance between survival and total annihilation. By nightfall, the immediate German offensive had been blunted, though at great cost. Tanks were destroyed, aircraft lay smoldering on land and sea, and many sailors and soldiers had perished. Yet the bunkers had been partially secured. Among the crates and documents recovered were fragments of a plan whose full scope remained a mystery, an operation that, if executed fully, might have changed the outcome of the European theater. As darkness fell, the Americans regrouped, surveying the devastation around them. Ships listed slightly in the waves, their decks scarred and blackened. Smoke still drifted from destroyed tanks and aircraft, mixing with the salty scent of the ocean. The night carried a strange quiet, punctuated by distant artillery fire and the occasional flare of gunfire. Yet beneath that quiet lay the chilling realization: the enemy's plan was only partially revealed. The true scale of the secret, hidden within the bunkers, remained unknown, and the forces that had almost obliterated the Americans could return at any moment. The stage was set for the next phase of the operation, a confrontation that would determine not only control of the coast and the sea but the fate of the discoveries that could alter history forever. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the coastline, mingling with smoke from the previous day's relentless bombardments. The water, blackened with oil and debris, lapped against the remains of shattered ships. Across the horizon, smoldering wreckage marked the scars of naval engagements, the once proud destroyers listing under the weight of battle damage. The air still carried the acrid tang of cordite, burning metal, and the deep, penetrating scent of salt water mixed with fire. American forces, though exhausted, pressed forward. Tank crews had repaired damaged vehicles where possible, while infantry cautiously moved along the ridges, scanning for enemy reinforcements. Overhead, fighter planes streaked through the sky, engaging the last German aircraft lingering above the battlefield. Flashes of tracer fire lit up the clouds in violent arcs, and the occasional explosion on the horizon signaled another aircraft lost to the relentless conflict. The bunkers, partially breached in the previous skirmishes, now drew full attention. American engineers and scouts worked frantically, prying open steel doors, lifting crates, and documenting the contents. The scale of what lay within was staggering. Crates contained experimental weapons, munitions of previously unreported calibers, and intelligence documents that detailed operations spanning entire regions of occupied Europe. Some barrels contained coded dispatches, others had schematics of prototypes that could alter naval warfare, torpedoes with extended range, early guided weapons, and new forms of naval mines. Every discovery was a revelation and a risk. German forces, though temporarily repelled, were reorganizing for another strike. Tanks shifted positions among forested hills, their barrels trained on the American positions. Artillery began to register, firing sporadically yet with deadly accuracy, sending showers of dirt and debris across the makeshift supply lines. The Americans, aware that their time was limited, worked feverishly to extract the crates, knowing that every second spent exposed them to renewed attacks. High above, dogfights erupted once more. American pilots, despite fatigue, executed daring maneuvers to suppress enemy fire. German fighters dove low, strafing bunkers and coastal positions, while bombers loosed small payloads intended to disrupt extraction efforts. Flak shells exploded in midair, showering sparks across both sides, creating a dangerous labyrinth in which every movement carried the potential for sudden death. On the coastline, the tank battle intensified. German armor pressed relentlessly against American positions, firing with calculated precision. Every shell that struck the bunkers sent vibrations through the steel doors, forcing men to brace and adjust rapidly. Fires ignited along the sand and forest floor, sending plumes of smoke into the heavy morning air. Amid the chaos, American gunners coordinated counterattacks, targeting key vehicles and creating temporary safe corridors to continue moving the crates. Amid the roar of artillery, explosions, and engines, the first shocking secrets began to reveal themselves. Some crates contained not just weapons, but evidence of German strategic planning previously unknown to Allied intelligence. Maps detailed troop movements, supply routes, and positions of hidden fortifications along the European coastline. Some documents suggested plans for operations that could have extended the war by months if executed successfully. Others hinted at experimental technology intended for both naval and aerial dominance, prototypes that could have challenged the balance of power entirely. The pressure of battle forced American soldiers into desperate improvisation. Men carried crates through smoke-filled corridors, sometimes dropping them into small boats, other times loading them onto trucks to retreat along rough paths under intermittent artillery fire. The bunkers themselves groaned under repeated shell impacts, sending dust, steel shards, and debris raining down onto the men below. Every movement was calculated, every step a gamble. Meanwhile, the sea had not ceased its assault. German destroyers appeared once more, attempting to strike the American ships positioned to provide artillery support. Salvos erupted from both sides, the ocean around them boiling with explosions and shattered debris. The destroyers on the American side returned fire, targeting each vessel with deadly precision. Ships rocked violently as shells impacted nearby, spraying the decks with water, wood, and molten metal fragments. By late afternoon, the Americans had managed to secure most of the critical crates, but not without heavy losses. Tanks were destroyed, aircraft were lost in the skies, and ships lay heavily damaged in the blackened waters. The bunkers themselves had partially collapsed in sections, threatening to bury key intelligence. Still, the most crucial revelations had been extracted: blueprints, coded messages, and experimental weaponry that had been hidden from the world for decades. Yet even in victory, the shadow of danger remained. The German forces, though scattered and temporarily repelled, had not been entirely eliminated. Reports indicated movements of reinforcements from nearby positions, additional tanks, aircraft, and small vessels poised to counterattack. The Americans realized the operation was far from over. The true impact of the discoveries would only unfold after surviving the continued engagement. As night began to fall, casting long shadows over the battered coastline, the Americans held their positions, weary but resolute. The bunkers, once shrouded in secrecy, had been partially unveiled. The stolen plans, experimental weapons, and intelligence documents now rested in Allied hands. The men knew that their survival and the extraction of this hidden cargo represented not just a tactical victory, but the uncovering of a secret the world had almost forgotten, a secret that might have changed the course of the war had it remained in enemy hands. And yet, the horizon remained ominous. Smoke still rose from scattered fires. The distant roar of artillery hinted at unfinished business. Across sea, land, and sky, the German forces had not vanished. They were merely regrouping, preparing for a final, desperate strike. The Americans, exhausted but determined, understood that the battle for the secret bunkers, and the intelligence they contained, was approaching its most critical moment. The early dawn was a pale, gray wash over the battered coastline. Smoke still spiraled from the remains of ships, tanks, and bunkers. The sea churned, blackened by oil, debris, and the remnants of fire. Across the horizon, the silhouettes of German vessels and tanks indicated that the enemy was regrouping, preparing for a decisive strike. The Americans, exhausted and weary, braced themselves for the climactic engagement that would decide the fate of both the secret cargo and the surrounding battlefield. Naval conflict reignited with ferocious intensity. Destroyers, already scarred and listing from previous encounters, unleashed salvo after salvo into the advancing German fleet. Water erupted in towering plumes where shells struck, sending waves lapping violently against the ship's sides. The German vessels responded with calculated precision, their guns tearing into the American hulls. Steel groaned under repeated impacts, fire spread across decks, and men fought desperately to maintain control over their crippled ships. Above the ocean, the sky became a theater of fire. German fighters and bombers descended upon the convoy, engines screaming, guns blazing. American pilots executed daring maneuvers, weaving through explosions and tracer fire, engaging enemy aircraft with precision despite fatigue and dwindling ammunition. Each crash, each fiery descent into the waves, marked both a victory and a tragedy. The aerial battle was a whirlwind of smoke, flame, and metal, as the sky itself seemed to erupt in chaos. On the landward front, tanks surged forward in relentless advance. German armored columns, reinforced and reorganized, struck with ruthless efficiency. The Americans responded with concentrated fire from tank destroyers and field artillery, creating temporary choke points. Explosions shook the earth, sending soil, debris, and metal fragments into the air. Every moment carried the risk of annihilation, yet the Americans fought on, determined to protect the bunkers and the secrets within. Amid the chaos, teams inside the bunkers worked frantically to extract every piece of intelligence. The steel doors had been breached, and crates containing experimental weapons, blueprints, and coded dispatches were being loaded onto trucks and boats. Some documents detailed German naval strategies, others contained specifications for advanced munitions and weapon prototypes never before seen by Allied intelligence. It became evident that the operation had been intended not just to harass or disrupt, but to tip the balance of naval and coastal warfare in favor of Germany. The final confrontation approached as tanks, artillery, and aircraft converged on the bunkers. German tanks fired relentlessly, some shells striking dangerously close to the extraction teams. Anti-tank crews returned fire, igniting fuel tanks and creating temporary barricades with burning debris. From the sky, American fighters swooped down, strafing the advancing armor and drawing fire away from the men below. The sea, too, erupted in final fury. Destroyers maneuvered through flaming waters, exchanging broadsides with enemy ships. Shells tore through steel, igniting fires and sending twisted fragments into the air. Amid the cacophony of artillery, engine roars, and explosions, the Americans succeeded in securing the most critical portions of the hidden cargo. Every recovered crate, every preserved document, represented not just a tactical achievement, but the reclamation of a secret nearly lost to history. Suddenly, one of the bunkers partially collapsed under repeated tank fire. Smoke and dust poured out, obscuring the view of the surrounding battlefield. The men inside barely managed to salvage remaining crates, dragging them into trucks as artillery shells exploded around them. Every heartbeat was a test of endurance, every second a battle between survival and destruction. Yet, by sheer determination, the Americans emerged with most of the secret materials intact. As the battle waned, German forces began to retreat, their tanks damaged, aircraft destroyed, and ships sinking or limping away. The Americans, though battered and diminished, held the field. The coastline, once a pristine stretch of sand and forest, was now a graveyard of metal, fire, and ash. Ships floated like hollowed-out shells, tanks smoldered in twisted wreckage, and planes rested in shattered fragments across sea and land. The significance of the recovered intelligence was staggering. Plans for experimental weaponry, covert naval operations, and advanced strategic blueprints were now in Allied hands. Historians would later realize that the secrets hidden in the German bunkers, if executed fully, might have prolonged the war, shifted naval dominance in the Atlantic, or endangered supply lines across Europe. The courage and endurance of the Americans had prevented a disaster that history had almost forgotten. By dusk, the battlefield was silent but for the occasional crackle of dying fires. The sea reflected the orange and gray sky, still scarred by the remnants of the battle. On the coast, exhausted soldiers surveyed the wreckage, aware that they had not only survived a coordinated, multidimensional assault but had uncovered a secret almost lost to time. The discovery, and the battle to secure it, would remain a testament to resilience, courage, and the thin line between knowledge and devastation. Across the Atlantic, the Germans retreated, leaving the Americans to claim both the battlefield and the secrets within the hidden bunkers. The world would never fully know the scale of what had been recovered, or the shadow of what had almost gone unnoticed, a forgotten clash, a hidden plan, and the narrowest escape from a disaster that could have changed the course of history. As night fell completely, a final sense of uneasy calm settled over the coast. Ships floated in silence, tanks lay smoldering in the dunes, and planes rested in wreckage-strewn fields. Yet beneath the quiet, the magnitude of the day's events lingered, a secret uncovered, a war almost altered, and a reminder that history's most pivotal moments often happen in the shadows, unnoticed by the world, yet shaping it forever.